Now for something completely different.
The Bitchspot Report. Welcome to the Bitchspot Report, the atheist podcast that isn't afraid to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. We hope we can entertain, engage, and perhaps even enrage you with discussions of religion, politics, and beyond. Now let's begin this episode of the Bitchspot Report. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Cephus, author of the Bitchspot blog and general disgruntled conservative atheist. I wanted to take a moment before I kick off the show to make an announcement. But first, I think I have to talk about it a little, and I know this is going to come off as bitching, but this is the Bitchspot Report, and I'm a very direct, honest, and open kind of guy, so there you go. As anybody who's been listening knows, I've been actively looking for a replacement co-host for the show for quite some time, someone who embodies the nature of the show. I started this podcast after having fought against doing one at all for a very, very long time. It was only when I felt that all the pieces were in place, that all the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed, that all the personnel were in place, that I decided to give it a shot. Now, it's been a blast. I love doing it, but now, due to problems with the former co-host that I'm just not going to go into, all of those things are no longer true. This has left me with the weekly frustration of trying to beg, bribe, and blackmail someone into sitting in the co-host chair, and often, I'm just not able to do it. That's not anyone's fault, and certainly, I don't want to blame anyone for being busy. Real life always comes first, and I'm eternally thankful to those who have either stepped up or have offered to step up, whether they've actually been on the air or not. Thank you all. I really appreciate your effort. However, as I've said before, it's just no fun for me to do this show alone. Sure, I've got lots to talk about, but the time required to do a solo podcast, as opposed to one that I might do with Hausdorff, is really prohibitive. As an example, Hausdorff and I could record a 90-minute podcast, and it might take me an hour, if that, to edit the podcast down to a usable form. Doing it myself, to produce just an hour of content, it might take me 6 to 8 hours or more to script, record, and edit. Clearly, it's not a good use of my time, no matter how much I enjoy doing it. Therefore, as sorry as I am to say, this will be the last episode of the podcast for a while. I'm going to put it into hiatus until I can find a regular co-host, and I'm honestly not holding out much hope of that. See, I really do want a conservative atheist podcast. As much fun as I've had watching Hausdorff shift more and more conservative as we've talked, that's never been the purpose of the show. It's not like there aren't conservative atheists out there. There's a study out there that suggests that about 20% of self-identified atheists hold some or all conservative views. Unfortunately, I've come to realize that virtually all online conservative atheists are conservatives first, and they only want to talk about politics, and atheists a distant second because they'd rather not talk about it. I've had discussions with quite a few conservative atheist bloggers, and without exception, every single one has said no because they don't want to talk about religion. I do. I even had one person offer to be on the show. She was a conservative atheist that wanted to talk about religion, and then she up and vanished on me. I have no idea what happened there. Maybe the problem is that the two sides of the podcast are contradictory. Talking about conservatism seems to drive away most atheists, and talking about atheism seems to drive away most conservatives. I wanted to do something new and different and unique. Maybe this is just too unique. That's something for others to decide, I guess. That's left me with the option of continuing to limp along, doing solo shows, or having some of my excellent but liberal guests on once in a while, or just hanging it up until I can do it right. Originally, I was hoping that just moving to a bi-weekly schedule, that might make it easier to beg guests to come on. But I've realized that the begging part is something I really, really hate doing. It's no fun for me to beg. It's no fun for me to sit here and stare at a screen and do a podcast by myself. And if I'm not having fun, I'm pretty sure the audience isn't having fun either. So all you people who are used to me begging you on a weekly basis to come on, relax, I'm done. I've spent over a month asking everyone I could reach on every social network I could find, searching blogs and podcasts, begging people on Twitter and Google Plus and on forums and now on Facebook. Oh yeah, the Bitchspot blog does have a Facebook page now. I know I said I'd never do it, but sue me. I'm trying something stupid because it's supposed to be effective. I'll throw a link in the show notes, or you can just go over to the blog and there's a link there. Please jump on and like me. Anyway, therefore, I wanted to do a farewell show, one that just laid it out as it is, so people don't think I stopped caring. I do care. It really bothers me to do this. I committed to producing this podcast, but I keep my word, and I do what I say I'm going to do. Unlike some people I could mention who, well, just don't. If you enjoy this show, if you want to see it return, please let me know and tell your friends. I just don't get that much feedback at all. For all I know, there's only a handful of people listening. I do plan on keeping my Bitchspot Quickies YouTube videos going. Those have proven to be fun to do. If you have any questions you'd like to have answered or ideas for topics for a future Quickie, please let me know via email at the link on the site. I really, really do want to continue this podcast, but as I've said before, it can't be a solo venture. I need a partner, and to date, I've had little luck in finding one. But enough with the bitching. Let's get on with the show. And now the news. This story comes from the International Business Times, and boy is it a doozy. A Muslim cleric living in Europe has declared that women are not to eat, or even be close to, bananas and cucumbers in order to avoid sexual thoughts. The unnamed cleric has declared that if a woman must eat bananas or cucumbers, then they should be cut into small pieces, preferably by her husband or father. We all know how women have to be treated like children, of course. They're just not smart enough to do any of this on their own, right? After the initial reports came out, the cleric went on to add carrots and zucchini to his list of immoral fruits and vegetables. This story, of course, has resulted in much online mockery. Much of it from Muslims themselves, who are concerned that the cleric is making Islamic religious practices seem unreasonable. All right, guys, they're not unreasonable. They're just downright stupid. Of course, this isn't the only dumb thing Muslims are doing. In Saudi Arabia, for example, they've been arguing over whether they should allow women to drive. Clerics there have been claiming that putting women behind the wheel will make them all non-virgins. I guess they really don't understand how that works, do they? The nation's highest Islamic council warned that within 10 years of allowing women to drive, there will be no more virgins in the country because driving naturally leads to prostitution, pornography, homosexuality, and divorce. All right, you want more stupidity? I can do that. Staying in Saudi Arabia, women are required to cover themselves from head to toe in a long black cloak called an abaya. This leaves nothing visible except for the eyes. Now, some clerics are arguing that even allowing the eyes to be visible might be too tempting for some men, and that women who have, quote-unquote, particularly beautiful eyes ought to cover those as well. All right, guys, please do not allow these women to drive. Seriously. And while you're at it, don't let them shop for groceries because, they just might touch a banana. It would be the undoing of the entire Sharia law system. Seriously, though, the Muslims ought to stop worrying about crazy clerics making Islam look bad and just realize that Islam already looks bad to every rational person on the planet. The clerics aren't making it any worse. It's the people who believe any of this ridiculous nonsense in the first place. In fact, the clerics, whether they know it or not, are just pointing out how idiotic Islamic beliefs are. You can't get much more crazy than what some of these people really believe. I'd really like to think that most Muslims understand how wacky their beliefs look, and they'd rather just not let the rest of the world know about it. It's kind of like Scientology back in the days before the internet, when they didn't go around telling people about Xenu and the magical volcano thetans. They knew how it would make them look, so they just kept it to themselves. Isn't it about time the Muslims learned the same lesson? In fact, I think this is a lesson that all religions ought to take to heart. Magical flying horses, talking snakes, space aliens flying 747s, the face of Jesus on a cracker. It's all face-palmingly ridiculous, So why does anyone buy into it? Worse, why does anyone admit, with a straight face, that they do buy into it? As they say about how many licks it takes to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop, the world may never know. The next story comes from Reuters. China says its aim is to banish superstition and promote knowledge. China is trying to get more than 100 million religious believers to reject superstitious beliefs about things like sickness and death and instead embrace knowledge and science. China has, in recent years, had an explosion of religious belief due to their economic boom, and traditional Chinese are looking for something to reassure themselves in an increasingly complex and technological world. According to the head of the State Administration of Religious Affairs, for a ruling party which follows Marxism, we need to help people establish a correct worldview and to scientifically deal with birth, aging, sickness, and death, as well as fortune and misfortune, via popularizing scientific knowledge. He added, religion has been around for a very long time, and if we rush to try and push for results and want to immediately liberate people from the influence of religion, then it will have the opposite effect and push people in the opposite direction. The country's religious adherence is split. About half believe in Christianity and Islam, and the other half follow Buddhism or Taoism. They say they don't want to force religion to go away in the short term, but some cults, like the Falun Gong, have been banned entirely. The Falun Gong, which started in 1992, combined meditation, exercise, and a moral center to become one of the largest religions in China, estimated by some to have tens of millions of followers. However, the Chinese government, fearing the size of the religious movement, cracked down on it and made it officially illegal to practice. The founder of Falun Gong, Li Hongzhi, has been living in the United States since 1996, and practitioners have had to go underground within China, although the religion is practiced openly in nearly 70 countries. Officially, China opposes Falun Gong because it was, quote-unquote, opposed to the Communist Party of China, and the central government preaches idealism, theism, and feudal superstition. All right. While I'll certainly agree with China's stated goals, the promotion of knowledge and science and the elimination of religion is just not something you can do by force. China has a very bad history of abuse, and this is really a move to put all authorized religions under the umbrella and control of the Chinese Communist Party. Unfortunately, there's really no way to stop people from believing things, and some of the reports out of China really read more like the Spanish Inquisition than any rational educational program. There are reports of Falun Gong practitioners, for instance, who were sentenced to forced labor camps where they were tortured with hot pokers until they recanted their beliefs. There are reports of over 63,000 cases of torture by the state in an effort to end religious adherence, and, according to the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, there have been an estimated 65,000 people killed based on refugee testimony. Additionally, there have been allegations of organ harvesting from theists in religious re-education camps, resulting in an unknown number of deaths. China has denied such allegations, claiming to follow the guidelines of the World Health Organization, but has admitted that the majority of their organs harvested for transplantation have come from executed prisoners. According to an official, religion basically upholds peace, reconciliation, and harmony, and it can play a role in society, but due to various complex factors, religion can become a lure for unrest and antagonism. Looking at the state of religion in the world today, we must be very clear on this point. Well, it's hard to really respond to this story because, on the one hand, they're right. Religion is a lure for unrest and antagonism. It fuels hatred and exclusionism and violence across the board. The world would be a much better place if religion and all other forms of irrational thinking simply ceased to be and people were well educated not only in science but in critical thinking. I agree with that entirely. However, I cannot agree with the methods that China is using, assuming the news reports are correct. You can't force people to reject their religious beliefs via torture. You cannot kill people for their organs. You cannot do what they are doing. It simply isn't acceptable, and the world ought to hold them accountable. I think this is one case where the goals are admirable, but the methods simply unacceptable. In a story from the Washington Post, Catholics are going to try evangelizing door-to-door as a means of attracting people to their services. In a move more common to Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons, Catholics are going to try their hand at door-knocking. According to Kenneth Livingood, a parishioner at Holy Church Parish in St. Ann, Missouri, "We've been tricked into thinking faith is a private matter. That's a lie. Faith is meant to be public, and there are many ways to share it. Catholics were instructed to go out in pairs, one of them who did all the talking at the door, and the second one was a silent prayer warrior. They switched off every other house. They were sent out with tracts, having watched a brief training video that told them how to respond to questions that may arise at the door. Some of these questions included, ask each person you meet if they are in need of prayer. No, I'm not in need of pointless talking to yourself. But if you're serious, if you really want to help, you can go out in the backyard and weed for me." It says that trying to provide too many facts about the church may cause misunderstandings. Yep, there's no point in letting people know just how ridiculous the beliefs you hold at your church are. It'll just make people slam the door in your face. Or how about, sometimes a person answering the door thinks getting back to regular Mass attendance would make their grandmothers very happy, which might present a welcoming start for conversation. Sorry, why am I supposed to do something insane to make my grandmother happy? Don't get that one. If the best you can do is play the emotion card, don't bother. It's also interesting that they note that early Saturday mornings may not make for the most receptive ears. Yeah, don't come to my door on Saturday morning, or Sunday morning for that matter. I'm not going to answer the door, and any stupid tracts you leave will get shredded unread. I'd much prefer that if they're going to come, they bring their A game and actually produce evidence that their beliefs are factually true. Oh, I know they can't do that, but it's a lot of fun to watch them try. See, I can identify with a lot of this. Back when I was religious, the church used to send kids out to all the houses in the neighborhood during the Sunday school period, that time between the 8 a.m. service and the 10:30 a.m. service, to try to get people through the doors and into the pews. I think they sent kids specifically because people tend to be easier on kids than they would be on adults. After all, stomping on a kid's theological balloon probably wouldn't cross the mind of a lot of adult non-believers. They don't expect kids to know much, so they don't have to answer any really difficult religious questions, and they don't have to justify their beliefs with reason or evidence. If a kid came to your door talking about Santa Claus, you probably wouldn't tell them they were crazy. The same thing goes for religion. Now, to be honest, I'd love to have a Catholic come to my door. I so rarely ever get any door knockers, and the few I get, well, they don't ring the bell. They just leave tracts and run. It wasn't always like that. I live in a very religious area. There is literally a church on every corner. Down at the end of my street is a Baptist church, and there's a Muslim mosque right next door. A block or two up the other direction, they're building a Korean Jehovah's Witness Kingdom Hall. Churches are everywhere, and back when we moved in, we got tons of people banging on the door to share the good news. At first, I ignored them, hoping they'd just go away. But eventually, I started talking to them, and that's when I realized that I knew a hell of a lot more about their religions than they did. It's shameful to see how ill-prepared a lot of these dudes on bikes are. They really know very little about their own theology, and they certainly know nothing about anyone else's. It's not that hard to blow anything they say out of the water, and I've had some really interesting conversations about their religions in which they always fare badly. Unfortunately, the churches just don't want their young members to be faced with any serious opposition, so it wasn't long before I got myself on everybody's blacklist. A lot of churches realized that I was better than they were, so they just stopped coming. I don't think I've gotten more than 2 to 3 people who've actually knocked on the door in more than a decade. Sometimes I seriously miss it. It's good debate practice, and honestly, the look on these people's faces when I demolish their cherished beliefs is just priceless. The Catholics seem to be getting desperate. They'll do almost anything to get people back in their churches. Well, anything except turn over all their pedophile priests to the authorities, of course. It's amazing the lengths the religious will go to in order to get around their own religious restrictions. This is a story from the Telegraph. While this practice is illegal in India and forbidden by Islamic law, in southern India, Muslim clerics are preying on the poor Muslim villagers, pushing them to marry their young daughters to wealthy foreign Muslims for a few weeks. In short, this is prostitution in a religion which considers prostitution to be a sin. A 17-year-old girl, whose name I would just murder if I tried to pronounce it, has broken open the seamy underground of Muslim one-month wives. She told authorities that her family was paid £1,200 to allow her to be married for 4 weeks to a 44-year-old Sudanese Muslim. She was taken to a hotel along with 3 other girls where the marriage ceremony was performed by a local priest. When the girl refused to have sex with her new husband, she ran away, but her family told her that she had to comply with his wishes or be punished. She reported this to the police, who arrested the groom and issued a warrant for the arrest of her involved family members, citing that it is illegal to marry a girl under the age of 18 in India. Inspector Vijay Kumar said, if a Sudanese wants to have sex, he has to pay 3 times more in Sudan because there are far fewer girls there, or he takes a second wife. In India, the girls are coming for a cheaper rate and they are beautiful. Even if they are only staying for a few days, they are doing this kind of illegal marriages for sex. Foreign Muslims come because they have found a way around the Islamic law that forbids prostitution. Local families do it because they have a lot of daughters and they can't afford to pay for all their wedding ceremonies. Thus, they have a string of contract marriages to fund their real wedding. The parents forged a new birth certificate that said the girl was 24 years old. She was never consulted. She was simply taken to the hotel and ordered to marry the man she found there. She's now in a foster home and hopefully will not be permanently scarred by the experience. I always find it amazing, or maybe disgusting, how far the religious will go in order to skirt the boundaries of their own religious laws. It's not just Muslims, it's Christians too. God says don't do something, find a way to justify it. Rationalize your way out of the theological corner you've painted yourself into. Pretend it's no longer a law. Sins just go away when they're inconvenient. Luckily, more and more people are realizing just how dangerous this behavior can be and are passing and enforcing laws against these practices. I honestly think we ought to do away with religious exemptions entirely. I don't care what your religion says. You follow the law, period. I see no reason to let the religious get away with murder, or in this case, virtual rape. I'm glad to see India is enforcing its laws, and just because someone has money or power or religious piety, there's no reason that they ought to get away with violating the laws. Throw the asshole in prison in India for a decade or two, and let's see how his wife and children back in Sudan like him.
This is the Leave It!
I bring this up today because there's been a furor in the online community over the death of a second child by Catherine and Herbert Scheibel, whose 8-month-old son, Brandon, died because they refused to take him to a doctor. They belong to a fundamentalist Christian church that believes in prayer and faith healing and rejects medical science entirely. Back in 2009, another son, 2-year-old Kent, died of bacterial pneumonia under the same circumstances. The Scheibels were on probation stemming from the earlier death that required them to seek out regular medical treatment for their children. They ignored the terms of their probation, again refusing medical treatment, and instead praying over their son. This time, they're certain to face criminal charges, and the possible removal of their 7 other children from the home, hopefully permanently. This story mirrors one that sparked me to create the religious horror show on my blog back in 2008, where I initially covered the high death rate of children, particularly in the Followers of Christ sect in Oregon. At the time, 15-month-old Ava Worthington had just died of pneumonia, an easily treatable condition that was made fatal by her religious parents' refusal to take her for medical care. Just 3 months later, Ava's 16-year-old uncle, Neil Begley, died from an easily treatable bladder blockage that caused him to be slowly poisoned from within. Parents in both cases served a little jail time, but certainly not enough based on their crimes. In 2011, Timothy and Rebecca Weiland were convicted of first-degree criminal mistreatment in the case of their daughter, who had suffered a massive hemangioma, which threatened her sight. She has improved since being removed from the home and provided with medical care. A few months later, a jury found Dale and Shannon Hickman guilty of second-degree manslaughter for their infant son David, who died just hours after his birth. The couple decided to give birth outside of the hospital, and when their son was born prematurely and severely underweight, they prayed over him instead of seeking medical treatment. You have to remember that all these cases happened in one small Oregon county, and were all members of the same fundamentalist Christian church, which has taught its members how to be irresponsible parents. It amazes me, it disgusts me, how people can claim that religion is harmless, that it doesn't hurt anyone, and we ought to leave it alone and not criticize people who practice their faith. But I think it's clear that in cases like these, and many, many more that I will get into, that's just not the case. Religion is dangerous. And not just to a bunch of backwoods nut jobs, but to everyone. It's not just dangerous with Christians. Every religion has problems, and these problems stem directly from the religious teachings and fundamental beliefs. There were two possible criteria that I established when I started the Religious Horror Show. First, these stories had to be caused directly by religion, such that if you removed religion from the equation, you could not reasonably or rationally attribute another cause to the action involved. Secondly, the story could not have happened without religion. The victims would not have engaged in the activity without their irrational religious beliefs. In the followers of Christ cases, for instance, if you entirely removed religion, I can't imagine any other reason for these children to have been allowed to die. All the conditions, while serious, gave plenty of time for the parents to get their children to a hospital. Even in the last case of the Hickmans, doctors said they had plenty of time to get their baby to the hospital, and there was a 99% chance his life could have been saved. Instead, they were too busy babbling at the sky to keep their child alive. Since we're talking about Christianity already, we can't avoid the elephant in the room, that being Catholic sex abuse. Since we've spent a lot of time on this podcast talking about this already, I only wanted to touch upon it briefly. There have been many, many thousands of Catholic priests worldwide who have been caught in sexually compromising situations, especially with children. The cause, at least in my estimation, although you're welcome to disagree, is that church policy requires these men to remain celibate, and that's just not a normal, long-term human state. Sex is very much a natural part of humanity, just like any other animal species. We are driven to reproduce. Our biology demands it, and the Catholic Church tries to stop people from acting like people. It's a disaster just waiting to happen. Therefore, when these men, who I'm sure were very committed at the time to being celibate, realize that's just not going to work, they turn to the resource most easily available to them, children. Children are easy to manipulate. They've been taught to respect and listen to authority figures, and when a highly religious child is told something by a member of the clergy who they've been taught has a direct line to God, they're butter in the hands of a sex-deprived priest. It's not surprising at all that so many priests take advantage of so many children. I'm certainly not excusing it. I'm saying that there are only so many ways this scenario is going to play out. There's a very strong religious component, both in the reasons priests get into these situations in the first place, but also how many people put themselves at the priest's disposal willingly because they have faith in what he says at Sunday Mass. Worse yet, the Catholic Church hierarchy has spent decades, perhaps longer, hiding these known pedophile priests, moving them around from parish to parish, keeping the records of their crimes away from the authorities because they don't want to look bad. Let's be honest, they want your money, and bad press isn't going to get them very many donations. Luckily, in recent years, the civil courts are hitting the Catholic Church for massive settlements, and this, among other things, is sending parishioners flooding out the doors. The Catholic Church is one of the worst hit in the general move away from religion. That's a good thing. But it's not just Catholics who have a problem. This is commonplace among many Christian groups. Take the case of Warren Jeffs, head of the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He spent some time on the FBI Most Wanted list because he fled a Utah arrest warrant. He was eventually arrested in Nevada, taken back to Utah, where he was found guilty of being an accomplice to 2 counts of rape. See, his church arranged marriages between adult men and young girls. In 2007, he was charged in Arizona with 8 additional counts, including sexual conduct with minors and incest. He was found guilty in Utah and sentenced to 10 years to life, but the sentence was eventually overturned due to incorrect jury instructions. However, Texas charged him too, this time with sexual assault on children, and he was sentenced there to life plus 20 years. Of course, Jeffs is crazy. He's declared that not only is the world going to end by the end of 2012, I'm sorry, but you screwed that one up, but that Jesus has been talking to him and has told him that he will get out of prison and that he will lead the New World Church. The FLDS Church is still around, and they still practice polygamous marriage. They even teach their members to get on the government dole and get all the welfare checks they can. In his book, Under the Banner of Heaven, John Krakauer wrote, "Fundamentalists call defrauding the government bleeding the beast and regard it as a virtuous act." In other words, they view the government as evil, but they still have their hands out. They're also outrightly racist. According to Warren Jeffs, the black race is the people through which the devil has always been able to bring evil onto the earth. Really nice people, these fundamentalist Mormons, huh? And of course, there are Baptists and other Protestant sexual predators too. The list goes on and on and on. So what else are Christians guilty of? Well, you've got these wonderful parents like Julia Lovemore in England, who murdered his 6-year-old daughter Faith by stuffing her mouth full of pages from the Bible. You know, that might be chalked up to another case of postpartum depression, except the whole family were religious loons. The British version of Family Protective Services had visited the house just prior to the murder, and her husband was having a psychotic episode, screaming for the devil to leave the body of his wife. They were involved because Julia has been repeatedly institutionalized and was convinced that her children were immortal. This was another case where the Lovemore stated that they would never call for medical treatment for their children. They would only pray for them to get better. Crazy people have a much higher tendency to turn to religion, and this is one more case where that's true. But there are others. Cases like Benjamin Etanlin, who beat his 5-year-old son to death because the Bible commanded, "Spare the rod, spoil the child." Not only was he not ashamed of what he'd done, he was proud of himself. He also whipped his other 2 children, a 2-year-old girl and a 1-year-old boy, but they survived. Good Father Benjamin was put away for 18 years, but he's not remotely sorry for what he's done. He was just being a good Christian. Even the clergy gets into it. Such is the case of Pastor Philip Caminiti, who ran a church in Black Earth, Wisconsin. He routinely told his parishioners to beat their children with wooden spoons and similar objects, and was found guilty of 8 counts of criminal conspiracy to commit child abuse. Again, following that same wonderful biblical command that got our friend Benjamin in trouble. Caminiti's brother was also charged with beating children with rods and dowels, as well as holding his wife and children hostage until they agreed to do what he said. On top of the beatings, his brother was charged with 4 counts of intentional mental harm to a child. Aren't the religious great? I think they're all nuts. So why do I bring up the insane in relation to religious horrors? Now, clearly these are all horrible events caused not only by religious fanaticism, but by insanity. Some might argue that it's just a broken brain acting out under the guise of religion, and that's really the point. Religion operates as a cover for the insane to operate under. Religion gets a pass, a special exemption from most people. If you saw someone who claimed to be talking to an invisible monkey, you'd call the guys in white coats and get that person off for a psychological evaluation. However, if that same person is talking to God, most people blow it off. The fear of offending the religious or criticizing religion is very strong in most places, even when the actions of the religious are clearly extreme and dangerous. But you can't say anything about it. You just might make them mad. But what about the Muslims? They're a favorite target these days. But what most primarily Christian critics don't realize is that Christianity was once no better than Islam is today. Granted, they didn't have airplanes to fly into buildings, but there was a time when Christianity was the horror of the European countryside. Even in early America, Christians were killing the godless Indians, murdering innocent women because they thought they were witches, etc. The fact that it isn't still the case, by and large, of Christianity is less due to the overall improvement of the religion and more to do with the moderating effects of a secular society, which has effectively neutered Christianity in most first-world nations. Those of us with a grasp on reality and a realization that religion is stupid have put the brakes on the ridiculous beliefs and fanatical actions of religious adherents. Islam has yet to feel that all-too-necessary secular influence. That's not to excuse the actions of Muslim extremists who strap on suicide vests, blow up runners at the Boston Marathon, or anything similar. There is a lot to criticize about modern-day fundamentalist Islam. That doesn't mean Christians haven't earned just as much criticism of their own over the years. I trust I don't have to talk about some of the more well-known horrors in the Muslim world, such as 9/11, the Boston Marathon bombing, or the numerous cases of willing suicide bombers who are willingly trading their own lives for promises of 72 virgins in the afterlife. Anyone who cannot see the harm in such acts needs to have their heads examined. These are the most easily visible and perhaps least questionable acts of a violent and sociopathic religious tradition, and one that certainly needs to be addressed by the planet at large. Unfortunately, far too many nations are utterly terrified of the perceived Islamic threat, and they are giving in to calls for Sharia law, Muslim self-governance, and censorship of criticism of anything that Muslims feel is holy. That should never happen. It is simply taking society down the wrong path, away from rationality and toward fundamentalism. There are a lot of lesser well-known cases, though, where harm is all too present. Take the cases of Muslim imams in the UK who are willing to marry adult Muslim men to girls as young as 12, so long as they can do it in secret and not risk imprisonment. British officials have been examining the problem and are making a move to stop all underage enforced marriages that occur in the Muslim community. But this has brought calls of religious discrimination from both Muslims and from the clueless who just don't understand the situation. Meanwhile, a study in a suburb of London has found at least 30 underage girls, some as young as 9 years old, who have been forcibly married to adult Muslim men. According to the director of the Iranian and Kurdish Women's Rights Organization, these marriages are not legal, but they are performed in a mosque, and they are valid under Sharia law. These girls are still expected to carry out their wifely duties, though, and that includes sleeping with their husband. They have to cook for them, wash their clothes, everything. They are still attending schools, struggling to do their primary school homework, and at the same time being practically raped by a middle-aged man regularly and being abused by their families. So they are a wife, but in a primary school uniform. This is clearly not only a problem for the Catholics, and as we will see later, it occurs in virtually all religions. Of course, Muslims are often criticized for their intolerance to other religions, and in some countries where they are in charge, people of other religions are summarily put to death for their refusal to convert to Islam. Christians did the same thing. The most well-known instance was this little thing called the Spanish Inquisition.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition!
There are some things that you don't hear about, though, like the case of a Christian father in Pakistan who, upon his refusal to convert to Islam, had his 2-year-old daughter kidnapped and repeatedly raped, then left for dead on the side of the road as a warning to other Christians who would not convert. The girl has had to have multiple surgeries in the years that have followed, and she may never be able to live a normal life due to her injuries. We all know of Muslim mistreatment of women, but you get cases like Fazilat Bibi, who was nearly beaten to death and permanently disfigured by relatives of a man who sought to marry her. Fazilat's parents refused the marriage request, and the family, taking offense at the refusal, cut off her nose and slashed her ear to make sure no man would ever want her. Upon seeing her daughter, Fazilat's mother had a fatal heart attack. This, like all Muslim honor killings, should be totally unacceptable in the modern civilized world, but the United Nations estimates that there are 500 religiously motivated honor killings worldwide every year, although some women's groups in the Middle East and Southwest Asia suspect that number could be as high as 20,000. So what else? How about the case of a Muslim mother in Cardiff, Wales, who was unhappy that her 7-year-old son couldn't quote the Quran to her satisfaction, so she beat him like a dog with a hammer over a prolonged period of time until the assault resulted in his death. Far from apologetic for her behavior, she then tried to burn the body to get rid of it. Yes, you could chalk this up to simple child abuse, except that the mother was convinced that she'd been told by the Muslim version of the devil to kill the boy, and now that it was done, she said she felt much, much better. Muslims are known for their penchant to riot at the slightest hint that anyone might have said something nasty about their book, their prophet, or their religion. It doesn't even have to be true to get them into the streets with torches and pitchforks. There's the case of a Christian barber in Pakistan who was accused, just accused, mind you, of blasphemy, and those fun-loving rioters were out in force again, burning down 160 homes, 18 businesses, and 2 churches in the small Christian community called the Joseph Colony. But hey, if that's not good enough for you, how about those wonderful Muslim extremists in Nigeria called the Boko Haram, who killed over 1,000 Christians in 2012 alone? Their total death toll is estimated between 3,000 and 10,000 in Nigeria alone, and these people are active across much of sub-Saharan Africa. They're not nice about it either. Many of their victims are either burned alive or have their throats slit. These are all very up-close and personal religious murders. Then again, you don't even have to be a non-Muslim to get murdered by a Muslim. The wars between the Shiites and the Sunnis have raged for years. It wasn't that long ago that a suicide bomber in Peshawar, Pakistan, and that's where a lot of these things seem to happen if you notice, blew himself up outside of a Shiite mosque, killing 22 worshippers and wounding another 30. Human Rights Watch says that more than 400 Shiites were killed in Pakistan in 2012 alone by Muslim-on-Muslim violence. These people will kill just about anyone, won't they? Well, that certainly makes the Christians and the Muslims look bad, but what about everyone else? The Jews, anyone? The Jews are one of the most offended religious minorities out there. They make the Muslims look like pikers. The second you say anything bad about Judaism or Israel, you're declared an anti-Semitic sleazeball. But that's not really fair. They've done a lot that deserves criticism. However, much of their problems are political and outside the focus of this segment. I will say only this. I get terribly, terribly tired of the old, remember the Holocaust, whine, whine, give us money nonsense. That said, though, there are just as many religious horrors committed under Judaism as under any other religion, and there are many cases to choose from. How about the case, and I'm going to murder this name, so forgive me ahead of time, Nehemiah Weberman, part of the largest Hasidic Jewish community in America in Brooklyn, New York, who was found guilty of 59 accounts of sexually abusing a 12-year-old girl. Weberman, an unlicensed Jewish therapist, had started seeing the girl when her parents complained that she was asking questions about her faith. Yeah, that's a bad thing, isn't it? Instead, she spent 3 years giving Weberman blowjobs and reenacting porn scenes. Once this came to light, at least 2 other girls came forward and filed similar complaints against Weberman. Weberman is currently in prison and is awaiting sentencing, and he faces up to 117 years in jail. At first glance, this might not be religious, although certainly Weberman was using his position within the Jewish community to get into contact with these girls. But other members of the Hasidic community started coming forward, demanding that Jews, just because they're Jews, can't go to jail. They started to threaten the girl and her family. They tried to bribe witnesses, and when that didn't work, they had the kosher certification of the family restaurant stripped to make life difficult for them. Maybe even worse yet, Weberman is part of the secretive Satmar Hasidic Council, whose job is to push moral behavior on the young. If he can't even keep it in his own pants, if he can't maintain his own morality and follow the law, how can we trust what he's pushing on others? We're finding that, like the Catholic Church, the insular Jewish communities will never willingly give up their members to criminal prosecution, no matter what they do. I could go on all day about all the various religious horrors, but I wanted to touch on just a few more. You might be asking yourself, wow, those Abrahamic religions are real shitholes, but what about everyone else? Ask, and your wish will be granted. Let's grab one of those fine bastions of peace, tranquility, and right-headed thinking, Buddhism. It's got a ton of its own problems. They're not nearly as peaceful as most people think. Buddhists in Myanmar have been murdering a lot of Muslims for that same old tired reason. They just don't believe in the same idiotic nonsense that we do. In the past month, at least 43 Muslims have been murdered in the Burmese town of Meiktila, often by being set on fire. In one video, a Buddhist onlooker of a burning Muslim can be heard to say, "No water for him, let him die." According to Michael Jerryson, a professor of religious studies at Florida's Eckerd College, particularly in the West, Buddhists are often seen as peaceful, and they're romanticized and idealized that way, but violence is found in all religious tradition, and Buddhism is no exception. Want more? Those Buddhists are randy buggers too. Take the case of 105-year-old Buddhist master Joshu Roshi, who came to the United States more than 50 years ago to teach the wisdom of Buddha, and we're now finding out that he's raped and abused women repeatedly over that time. Now, we're not talking just 2, 3, 4 women. We're talking hundreds. But these cases have been swept under the rug by the local Buddhist community for fear of offending their teacher. This is far from uncommon. We can point to case after case after case, such as reports out of Sri Lanka, where at least 110 Buddhist monks have been charged with sexual misconduct in just the last decade alone. However, as with the Roshi cases, these crimes were actively blocked and hidden by the Buddhist community. We can't rely on any religion, even the most outwardly innocent, not to use their religion and their religious position to commit crimes on the innocent. My last entry into this examination of the religious horror show is somewhat of a special case. It could have been included in the section on Christian horrors, but I want to give them the benefit of the doubt. Christians, especially Catholics, have expended a lot of effort in Africa to convert the heathens to their religion, and the Catholics have been perhaps the most successful. However, many African practitioners have combined Catholicism with ages-old tribal witchcraft beliefs. That's hardly a surprise. That's a tactic that Christians have used for centuries to convert the locals. Let them have their old holidays and practice, so long as they worship your God and, of course, give them your money. However, this has produced some very strange combinations, including vocal Catholics who believe in magic spells and incantations. Most dangerous among these are the beliefs that albinos, especially albino children, should be killed and their internal organs and skin used for religious rituals. It's very dangerous to live in some parts of Africa if you're an albino child. We have cases where albino children will have their arms or legs amputated by local witches, or worse, be killed outright so that their organs can be harvested. Even more widespread, going as far as India, are cases where innocent children are murdered or burned alive because they are accused of being witches themselves. In Papua New Guinea, the problem is so rampant that they had to pass a law against burning witches. Let me repeat that. The government had to pass a law specifying that it was illegal and a generally bad idea to light your neighbors on fire in the streets. Now granted, this is done in generally poor, uneducated areas, but seriously, how dumb do you have to be to murder your neighbors in this modern day because you think they're a witch? As I'm sure you can see, religion can be a dangerous thing, but I can imagine that you're also saying, well, those murderers and rapists and other religious riffraff, well, they're just a tiny minority. They don't represent the vast majority of religious adherents who would never ever do this kind of thing. Well, you're right. But the tons of liberal theists provide cover under which these religious monsters can operate. By insisting that religion gets special treatment, special rights, and special consideration, they give these animals room to maneuver. It is especially bad when people expect religion to be given an across-the-board pass, or that religious groups will hide the criminals within their midst for fear of looking bad to the world at large. That happens in every religion, every sect, every belief system. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about Catholicism or Buddhism or Scientology. All of these groups hide their misdeeds for fear of losing money and respect. But you might be saying, well, I don't do any of that. My religion isn't harmful. But I respectfully disagree. Your religion, whether you're willing to acknowledge it or not, teaches things that are simply not true. ideas and beliefs that are not defensible, of faith that cannot be demonstrated or justified by objective means. You're filling the heads of your children with superstitious nonsense. Your beliefs, especially as they become more fundamentalist, get in the way of human advancement. There was a time long ago that we lovingly call the Dark Ages, when religion not only slowed the advancement of knowledge, science, and human society to a crawl, in many cases it went into reverse. We spent nearly 1,000 years going nowhere fast because religion held sway over the land. If it hadn't been for religion, who knows where we might be today? Religion harms us all. It is detrimental to science, to exploration, to free and critical thought, and that's a weight that every religious person on the planet has to wear around their necks. It's your fault, and so long as you continue to hold these beliefs, so long as you continue to indoctrinate your children in these beliefs, so long as your beliefs inform your actions and your thought patterns and your voting habits, you are a constant harm to everyone around you. All theists, like it or not, are an inherent part of the religious horror show. Well, that's the show, and I hope you enjoyed it. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who has helped with the show, especially Hausdorff, who has come through in a pinch every single time. It's been fun, and I hope I can find someone to take over the co-host seat on a regular basis in the future. I think it's important to have a conservative atheist voice out here in the podcast land, but it's starting to feel like I'm crying alone in the wilderness, and that may be very likely true. Keep watching the website for future announcements, and I will say farewell and take care, and we'll see what the future brings. Thank you. You've been listening to the Bitchspot Report with your host, Cephus. You can follow me on Twitter at Bitchspot1. Please check out our podcast website at report.jdragononline.com. You can watch our podcast on YouTube at youtube.com/The Bitchspot Report. We're also available on iTunes. The link is at our site. Please subscribe and rate us. It really helps us a lot. We'll be back next week for another fact-filled episode of The Bitchspot Report. Please tune in again.